we're very honored to have Aida Uni Sanchez here today. And I'll say a little bit about her sort of trajectory and how she got here. But she's an associate professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and an honorary fellow at the University of York. She has a PhD in environmental sciences from the University of Southampton in the UK, and a BA and a master's degree in biology from the University of Barcelona. She has over 10 years of work experience in 12 countries in tropical Africa, where she has focused on tropical forest ecology and carbon stocks, forest use and valuation by local communities, and communities' adaptation to climate change. She received the 2020 L'Oreal UNESCO Women in Science UK Award for Sustainable Development and the Christian Michelsen Prize for Outstanding Development Research, Norway, in March of 22. So please join me in welcoming Aida.
So thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for those that are online. I think it's not too many yet, but yeah. So it's very nice to be back to the CSU. I was here about 5 years ago, so I used to join the Africa Center talks. So I'm very happy that now I'm coming to give one myself. So it's really cool. So yes, so I'll be talking today about a paper that we have in review, and it's been in review for a long time in Nature Climate Change, but as you may guess, when you go for big journals, reviews are very tough, so that's why it's been stuck there for a long time. But yeah, I'll be talking about the kind of more social work I do on local communities and climate change adaptation, and this paper is focused on 10 African mountain regions. And first of all, I wanted to say that I haven't done this work alone. It's a collaboration with 20 other colleagues, most of them from Africa, and yeah. Also, there's Julia Klein that works here at CSU that's been involved in this work. So, how do we understand climate at the local scales? So, at the local scales, we rely on meteorological data, but of course, in many parts of the world, there's not a lot of it. So, there's maybe few variables that measure, maybe only temperature, maybe only rainfall. There's maybe short-term records because the equipment was set up not so long ago, maybe 10 years, and to really track climate change, we need 30, 40, 50 years. And then there's problems with the sensors sometimes, so it's hard to repair them or impossible sometimes. Or sometimes there's civil war and conflicts that makes recording challenging, so there are gaps in the records. And of course, there's also a lot of records that were manually collected before and they're not digitized, like the amount of rainfall, for example. So this is just a map about the amount of records. The left side we have precipitation, and on the right side temperature for African mountain regions, and the density of stations for every 10,000 square kilometer, and this is really low except for precipitation in kind of South Africa. And for example, for the Cameroon Highlands, they're here, there's barely any record, as you can see, this gray cap. But even in the other areas that look kind of orangey, this is really low density compared to the data we would get from Europe or North America on the way. So then the question is, how can we understand climate change impacts better in these regions where we don't have meteorological data? So that's why the local communities and their knowledge comes in. So usually traditional ecological knowledge builds on from the intergenerational sharing of observations and experiences. So the elders will give it to the children, how things were before, and the children, as they grow up, they also have their own experiences, and they share their experiences and what they perceive of changes with their children and so on. So the idea is that we can tap on this information to complement the meteorological data to try to understand the changes in climate in some parts of the world. And this paper that came put up here, Savo paper from 2016, this was kind of the big, first of the big studies. There's been others after, where they combine indigenous knowledge from different parts of the world. So they gather it from 2,000 locations, over 2,000 locations in 137 countries. You can see quite a lot from Eastern and Western Africa here in the diagram. And we kind of put together what communities were saying that there was changing on the climate. So for example, a lot of them reported increased temperature. This is the red dots that you can see in the screen. And also a lot of them reported changes in the seasonality, so maybe changing the distribution of rainfall. This is kind of the green dots in the screen. But of course, there were also other changes reported, like for example, in Mongolia, most communities were reported increased rainfall or decreased rainfall or changing in patterns. So a lot of changes were reported by these communities. And in areas where we do have historical meteorological data, they tend to agree, but of course it depends on which variables are compared. So for example, there's John Salerno that is also working at CSU that's been showing for Uganda, which would just be somewhere here, how the meteorological data available actually agrees with most of the perceptions by the local farmers. But remember that in many parts of the world, we don't have meteorological data, and that's why actually we want to look at what communities are saying. And it's not just on the climate, local communities also helped us understand the impacts because they've been living there and they've been dealing with the changes. So for Africa, a lot of the changes reported relate to changes in the crop yields and pests and diseases on the yields. But also communities, if they're fishermen communities, they might be reporting changes on the stocks, the distribution, or the species that they're catching on the ocean or the freshwater. But of course, if we want to compare between sites, we need to standardize the way we are collecting these social or these perceptions. So there was a paper by a colleague, Victoria Relis Garcia. She's based in Barcelona in Spain. She came up with a typology on how we can gather social data on perceptions of climate changes and impacts. And if you are interested or you work in the topic, I'm very happy to share this. And there's a protocol on how we gather this data so we can compare it across sites. So this is, for example, the standardization for climatic changes, but they also did it for changes in the physical system, for example, in terrestrial systems or marine systems, and also changes observed in the more human systems, or like on crops of livestock or like human health. So also by looking at what local communities are perceiving or they feel it's been changing, we can also understand not just how things have changed and the impacts, but also what are they doing to adapt and what are the barriers to either current adaptation or potential adaptation. And when we talk about barriers, usually IPCC groups them into 6 categories: the knowledge and technology, physical constraints, so sometimes there's just no more water or no more land to do something, economic constraints, human capacity, sociocultural or governance and institutions that limit the adaptation. It's just for you to realize that there's different dimensions on what might be the limits to adaptations, not just the financial, for example. So now this was like a short, quick overview of the topic, so now let me take you to the paper that I wanted to present today. So what we did is that we did focus group discussions and a questionnaire to 1,500 farmers in 10 mountain sites in Africa, so it's 150 per site. And what we did is we used this standardized protocol by Reyes Garcia on climatic changes observed, impacts, and also adaptation. We showed this questionnaire using focus groups in every site, and we kind of fine-tuned it on what was relevant. So if there are questions about as the fisheries change and we are working in a mountain region, you can already anticipate those questions would not be relevant there, so we didn't use them. So we kind of fine-tuned the questionnaire to every site while keeping some questions the same across sites so it could be compared. So these are the sites we worked, and in case you cannot read them, is the Pambutus Mountain in Cameroon, we have the Valley Mountains in Ethiopia, Mount Kenya and Aberdare Range in Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro Nzunga in Tanzania, Kigezi Highlands in southern Uganda, Nyungwe and in Rwanda, Kibira in Burundi, and Itombe Mountains in Congo. So the way we also did it is that we had the master student working from a local university in every site, a professor, so it's very participatory, and then it was me and a couple of colleagues from kind of north-based universities that were also working in the project. And I actually been working in 6 of these 10 sites myself, so I kind of know these areas. I mean, not super well, but at least a little bit. So this was the first part, the fieldwork, and then there was a second part where we got together all digitally, because this was started during the pandemic, on discussing the constraints and opportunities for adaptation in these different sites. And also we wanted to determine if the adaptation was what we call incremental or transformational, and we used the framework developed by these guys, the Mapfumo 2017. And just very briefly, I'll explain what is the difference between incremental adaptation and transformation. So incremental is when change are gradual and little by little, so we can do something. So for example, maybe the rainfall distribution is changing, so it's less rainfall, so we now use improved varieties of maize that can grow in a shorter period. So we try to compensate the changing rainfall by having varieties that can give us the same yield in a short amount of time. So this would be incremental adaptation. But of course, sometimes the changes are so large in extent or so intense or so big in size that then we're required to change completely. So transformation means a big shift in our system or in the process, and it can be either in the economic, social, or ecological domains. And I always like to give this example that I read from Mozambique, where the farmers that were living there were experiencing so many floods that even improved varieties that can grow in shorter periods of time were not useful to them. So actually at the end they became fishermen, because to benefit and to make a living from this kind of continuous flooding. So they gave up their maize farming and they kind of focused on the fishing during the flooding events that became more intense. So this would be an example of a transformation. So, of course, there are some limitations in my study, and I'd rather acknowledge them first before I get questions about it. So we did not compare the perception of changes with meteorological data or crop yield data, because actually we don't have a lot of information from most of these sites, not all of them, but most of them. We didn't investigate if the adaptation that we are reporting or the farmers are reporting are complementary or substitutions, or if they're sustainable or effective on the long term, because of course this is also a challenge. And also we focus on climate change impacts, on the drivers, on the changes in livelihoods that people are doing, but of course there might be other drivers of these changes. And I'll discuss a little bit about this a little bit later. So the results, and I'll show you in a second, but it's a lot, so I thought I'll just highlight the main points. So most farmers report increased temperatures, which I guess we are not surprised, as the world is warming. Reduce fog. So fog is an important source of water, or like the dew, and it reduces evaporation, so it's important for crops in mountain regions, or at least on mountain regions. They also reported changes in rainfall and distribution, and increase in extreme drought events, and changes in the wind, particularly during the rainy season. And I just wanted to highlight that the IPCC chapter on mountains, for example, talks a lot about changes on water resources in the world, but also in Africa, but it never mentions fog. So this is something that, on a way, local communities' view can help complement some of these bigger studies that are going on. So this is an example of what we found, and I know it's a little bit of a confusing figure, but black means they said yes to this change, the respondents in that site, gray means they said no, and white means it's not relevant. So for example, in some mountains, the elevation is a bit lower, so it's not that they don't report that there's less frost now, it's actually that they never saw frost. So that's why the circle is white, it's not relevant or applicable in that site. So overall, above all, most respondents across site reported an increase in temperature. I go from left to right on the figures. Reduced rainfall in the long rains if they had 2 rainy seasons. Usually a start of the long rains, particularly in Eastern Africa. More dry spells, more showers, more extreme floods, but extreme floods were more mentioned in just 2 sites, the Burundi site and Udzungwa. In Tanzania, more droughts were mentioned in Udzungwa, Bale, and Monkenya. Fewer foggy days, and as I said, less frost, but just in some sites. Then if we look at the impacts, they mostly report reduced stream flow during the dry season, reduced crop yields, reduced milk production on cows, increased soil erosion. This is because they say even if there's the same rainfall, it's distributed differently, so there's like events that are stronger, more rain comes at once and then there's less, so that's why the soil erosion, they link with the increased soil erosion. Then more diseases for crops and livestock, and reduced human health. And I highlighted the reduced human health because this is also something that most previous studies on impacts don't consider, although now there's more research on it. And in the mountain regions, it was mostly related to three things: that malaria is coming up with increased temperatures. We found increased malaria prevalence at high elevations. Also, in some areas, it was linked to an increase on respiratory diseases, and the local people link it to changing rainfall patterns. So, dry spells during the rainy season or wet spells during the dry season change the link to airborne diseases. And the last one was waterborne diseases, and this was in areas where there were more droughts. So now, because of more droughts, people had to gather water from maybe less clean conditions, or sometimes from areas where livestock was also going. So then there was a more likelihood of contamination of this water and diseases related to this. So if we look spatially, a bit of the same figures. So the top left is more soil erosion, so more heavy rains, particularly in the East Africa. Lower yields on crops, most people mentioned that, an increase in pest and diseases on crops, and the people are less healthy. These are the ones most people mentioned. Then for coffee, a fair amount of coffee farmers also mentioned the yields for coffee are changing and increased pests and diseases. For the sites that had cows, also reduced milk was mentioned, and an increase in disease not just for cows but also for other livestock was mentioned in most sites. And then what are people doing to adapt to these changes? So mostly they're changing the planting dates. So if the rainfall distribution is changing, they have to amend. They're sowing the seed twice. This is also something that is not commonly asked in these kind of questionnaires. It's okay, you planted your seeds and the rains didn't arrive. So what do you do now? So now you have to plant them again. So of course it means that you need to have the money or access to seeds twice, which costs resources, right? Then changing to improved varieties, increasing soil conservation techniques, increasing irrigation if you have access to it, more fertilizer, pesticide, and veterinary care, which also, you need money for that, and diversifying into all off-farm labor, but it also depends on what are the opportunities for other labor regarding farming. In some areas, there are not so many opportunities. So if we look at the spatial distribution of these, you can see that improved varieties, top left, quite common, changing planting dates, sowing the seed twice, increased use of pesticide and fertilizer, quite common. You can already see that in Congo this is not happening because they're actually completely unavailable. It's not that they're expensive, you actually don't find them in this mountain region. Increased irrigation, only in areas where you can actually have more water. Increased use of soil conservation techniques. You can see that in two sites, the Congo side and in Cameroon also, this is not so common. And I'll go back to that, but in this area are conflict areas, so people invest less on things that would take time for you to get the benefit. So it's very labor intensive to most of the soil conservation techniques. So if you're not sure you're farming the same piece of land next year, you're unlikely to invest on it, right? Then changing farm location near streams, only in Udzungwa and in Burundi they were doing that, so you also need to have enough land available so you can change your farm. And in Udzungwa, some farmers were also increasing the farm size. Again, you need to have land available for that. So in highly populated areas, which is actually common in many African mountains that the population density is high, moving your farm or increasing the size of your farm is very unlikely to be a possibility for you. So we also found, this is actually some comments we got from the reviewers, but I actually think they make our paper a lot better. So they asked us to see if there was a relationship between how many climate changes they reported, the farmers, and adaptation responses. So if they were doing more things, and we found no relationship. And actually, the driver, we think that we didn't find a relationship because of the second part, because household wealth was the strongest driver of adaptation. So if you have more resources, you can invest in doing more things, right? You can buy fertilizer, you can buy pesticide, you can buy seeds twice, you can diversify your livelihoods, maybe not on labor, but in other things. So usually if you have more money, you're likely to be able to do more things. And this figure for one side, usually the left arrow facing up is the richer household, the facing down is the poorer households, and this is the average household. And how did we determine household wealth? This was relative, and it was based on a locally built wealth index, where we asked people in the focus group, what do rich people in this mountain have? Do they have a car, a motorbike, or a bicycle? So it's relative, context specific for each side. So in a way, it's not really comparable across sites. The wealth, I mean, the richer households in the poorer households in Mount Kilimanjaro are likely to be way richer than the richest household in Congo, for example. So they're not comparable, the wealth index across sites, but within a site, rich and poorer households are different. Doesn't make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. That was a question. And then I just wanted to highlight that even in sites where we have a similar adaptation response, this is about increasing vegetable or fruit production for like income generation, the driver of these of farmers choosing to do this might be very different. So just, I wanted to show that, so in Kenya, it was mostly driven by the fact that urban markets are nearby. So Mount Kenya and Abateres, they're very close to Nairobi, which is the capital. So it's easy for farmers, and there's a good road network. So it's easy for farmers to, if maize yields decrease, we can maybe now grow more tomatoes and fruits and sell them to the city. In Valley Mountains, this is quite far from the capital, but this was driven by a government-supported program. So you see the same response, but driven by different things. And in Rwanda here, it was actually driven by the lack of regulation from the government, so the opposite of Valley. So in Rwanda, the government chooses what you can grow in your farm. So it's very restricted on your choices. So if you are in the, whatever they call it, the maize region, you grow certain variety of maize, and that's it. You cannot grow anything else. And also with the cattle, it's also very regulated for livestock. But actually, the only thing they don't regulate yet is if you move into fruit or vegetable production. So the richer households are moving into this because it's a good way to make money, and it's a little bit more flexible. So you see the same response, but driven by different reasons. And I just wanted to highlight that in conflict areas, as I said, in Eastern Congo and Western Cameroon, the Anglophone area of Cameroon, there were few adaptation responses, and it's not just because of maybe poverty and lack of access to funds, but also because of this insecurity with what may happen next as people are moving because of the conflict. So for example, nobody was daring to invest in vegetable fruit production in Itombo, although they're not very far from South Kivu and area, which is two of the largest cities in Congo. So with this participatory project process with the co-authors, we came up with this list of constraints and opportunities per site. So I just said how many sites mention these, the constraints and the opportunities, red for constraints, green for opportunities. So the main constraints were lack of land, as I said, highly populated areas in most sites, lack of access to credit, so that's why the wealthier households can do more than the others, and lack of access to certain technologies or new technologies. And then if we look at opportunities, that there's external actors were present and perceived as helpful, so it's not just being there, but also feeling that you can talk to them. Then awareness of climate change impacts, and mobile communications available. And this is something that actually I haven't thought, but it came from some of our colleagues there, because it's been a change, and you may see from other areas where mobile phones are used to document outbreaks of new diseases, to report and give advice to farmers on what to do with these new diseases that are coming up, or other things like when to sow your seeds. So there's been some projects on how mobile communication can improve or help people adapt. So that's why it came up as an opportunity. There's no mobile network everywhere, but I think in two sites there's no mobile network, but so most of the others, they thought it was an opportunity. And then we tried to place them between incremental or transformational adaptation. And as you can see, most of the sites are quite on the left, so farmers are doing small changes to adapt. Nobody has gone into fishing yet, but of course fishing in mountains is difficult. But I just wanted to say that 3 sites came up as the more to the right side. These are Valley Mountains in Ethiopia, Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro. And it was interesting because we ranked them the highest, it was because of the social capital. So when something new happened, it spread out fast, which it was very interesting. And it was not, so in Bali was a lot of the extended families, and in Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro was a little bit more, maybe a more innovative mindset, more farmers having being educated or having educated children that kind of give them some more outlook looking, or maybe at least less afraid of trying new things on the way. and linking to the markets, because both Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro are the main big urban areas that are nearby, so you can also have this access to markets and other things. So this is kind of the summary. So the reviewers also told us, okay, so what it means all this, can you come up with some key priorities? And I was like, oh, that's really nice, so we can kind of give ideas of what to do next. So these are the 3 priorities we came up with. So improve access to credit, technical skills and markets, and increase knowledge exchange among actors. So about more transdisciplinary work in a way. So the first 2 are not just for mountain regions. This is common and is widespread on farmers' adaptation in other regions, right? But maybe in the mountain region, we highlighted the case of what we call the elite farmers in Mount Kenya. So elite farmers are farmers that tend to be a little bit richer and have access, maybe be better connected to new technologies or new things. So, and they kind of experimented. So they experimented with new varieties of coffee. So they got, for example, in one of the villages, they kind of were the ones pushing to get fair trade and organic coffee certification, which means that they could sell the coffee for a higher price. And they started it, but then the other members in the community kind of joined. So they were driving the change at the local level, but on the way they were very inclusive. This is the Meru area, which is an ethnic group that have also very strong cultural ties and kind of social capital in a way. So they were very keen to bring in the other neighbors and colleagues. Oh, try this new coffee variety, you know, just if you cannot pay the fee to do this year, it's okay, you just try it out, next year you can do it. So they were very inclusive and that promoted change. So it was not just government-led or NGO-based. We thought it was quite cool that it was kind of led by the private sector because of these richer farmers. And then point 3, we thought it was very interesting, and it was something that I didn't really anticipate when we started this work. It was about the national policies on the governance. So in Rwanda, as I said, the government chooses what you grow in your farm. And this is okay if you are maybe, let's say, middle income or higher income. If you are really poor, this is really bad because it gives you that you have very few options. There's a few authors that have, researchers that have documented that this strategy has boosted crop yields, but has increased inequality. So it seems that the poorer farmers have fewer options than they used to have. So it's good to think about also what it means when we create a new policy, that it might help a lot or most of the people in the country, and maybe some are even further behind than we anticipated. And also that in terms of governance, so in these conflict-affected areas, this is in Cameroon and Anglophone Cameroon, which is where there's kind of sadly a war zone at the moment, and Eastern Congo, where there's a lot of insecurity because of the rebel groups, where people have few options to invest, not just because the infrastructure is not there. So as I said, there's no access to either fertilizer or pesticides. They don't exist, and you cannot find it. There's no mobile phone network, so it's a long way to go before they can get the text message, hey, the rains are coming late this year, or it's just not possible. But also because there's limited options for labor or other jobs or access to markets, but also people are not willing to invest in their kind of long-term things. So for example, in Congo, they used to grow coffee, but in that area, nobody does it anymore because it's so unsafe. So they don't know if they'll be farming next year in the same area. So why would you care for your coffee bushes, right? It takes time for you to collect the benefits from it. So I think we need to think more about what it means to work in these areas where fewer actors are working, and even the government is very weak. So as I said, I didn't do this alone, so some of my colleagues they did most of the field work. I only did one side myself. And this is Abraham, top left, in Ethiopia. This is Alina in Burundi, and this is Rodrigue in DRC, and of course we got funding from Mountain Research Initiative, but also by Mountain Sentinels, which is based here at CSU. So thank you, and if you have questions or comments, I'm happy to take them. The paper is still in review, so we're still trying to make it better, and the idea is to also turn it into, hopefully once it's published, into more locally based policy brief where we give some advice or ideas about it. But it's been a very long journey with this paper, so but we learn from it, so yeah.
Okay, questions?
The rest of your email is blocked.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, you can also drop me an email if you want to know more or you want a copy of some of the work I mentioned here. So maybe I should say something. So what I say what? Maybe die. End of slide. So, okay, sorry. Let me just put it like this so we can see who is online also, in case they want to ask a question. So the paper, the big paper where we compared the mountains is this one, but actually what we did is that every 2 sites we also have a comparative study across 2 sites led by one of the master students. So those comparative studies are already published and they provide more detail at the kind of some mountains. So if you want that, I can also share. Yeah, please.
When I saw you listing constraints and opportunities, did you list constraints in their order of severity and priority with the farmers?
So this is, everything can be improved, right? I always say. So we only discuss constraints or in the focus group and not in the questionnaire. So now looking back, I wish I had the list also added to the end of the questionnaire so we would have more quantitative data. So it's run by us, or not by us, but like for the kind of study site expert, so the people that work there, because not every village agree on the same. So that's why it was a bit difficult.
Yeah.
But I think if I do it again, I would rather have it in the household questionnaire as well, so that you have more quantitative data.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because roads were like second from the top, and that made me go, does that mean they're really difficult, or is it lower? I didn't know.
No, it was just how many sites mention it as among the top 3. So it's a bit difficult to display the data because we have a lot of information.
Mm-hmm.
So it means that 7 sites, for example, cited scarcity of land as one of the top 3 main constraints. So yeah.
Number of sites. Okay.
Yes.
Ranked
Number
by
of mountains
sites.
that mention that site.
Okay, great.
Question? Yes.
First of all, I just want to say how excited I am to read that paper. This is so
Thank you.
cool. I think it's going to be really helpful for my research, and I can only imagine how many more very practical research projects are going to spring from this paper.
Well, I hope so.
So
been a
it's
long
really
journey,
cool.
Seriously.
I do have a question, though, also. And I know that this is a new statistic that you just added because of the reviews, but I was surprised that the amount of adaptation people were able to do wasn't impacted by the number or the amount of change they saw at all. I'm not surprised that wealth was the biggest factor. That makes a lot of sense. But I was wondering, when you did that statistic, was it just the number of changes they reported? Like, did it account for how significant one single change
No,
might
exactly.
be?
It was just the number of changes they reported.
Okay.
Because the way we ask the questions is a little bit tricky, right?
Mhm.
It's there's a lot of information. So of course, also the adaptation you can do. I mean, one change might drive you in different directions, right?
Sure.
If in one site, for example, I'm just giving an example, the rains arrive late, so you change your planting date. So in this case, changing planting date and sowing seed twice would be in the same direction for this particular change, but maybe a different change, I don't know, increase in flooding would have, some of them are,
Right.
are opposite
They're
directions. So I think that's why it's hard to do. It was just something that reviewer asked because some other people reported that. But actually, I think there's other ways to do it better at the site level. But just of course, as you combine sites, it's hard to do because there's a lot of information that might go in opposite directions. So it might just be that it's just canceling each other out, right? That's why it's not so.
Right, sure.
Yeah, please.
Could you be more specific about the area you studied in Bali? Is it
It's
south?
it's near Harena Forest because that's why we were interested in the coffee. So first we wanted to have coffee farmers everywhere, but then it turned out that some areas coffee was no longer grown, whatever. So it was near Bali, but I forgot exactly the villages, but I can look them up after if that's relevant. But I never selected any of these particular villages. I mean, you just study areas where we had good context, and then the researcher there said, okay, we have to have a compromise because we're sending a master student alone to do the field work. So it needs to be a place that master student can reach relatively easy, maybe with a motorbike or something, but also that it's safe because some areas are not so safe. So they are the ones who selected the villages. And I don't have a lot of, I couldn't show everything, but also in every site we had 2 villages at a slightly lower elevation and 2 slightly higher because we wanted to see if there were more changes reported at the low elevations and the higher, but I mean, I couldn't show everything here. But in most sites, yes, there were more changes reported in the lower elevations. So in a way, great, more increased temperatures or more drought or whatever. Yeah, please.
I'd like to address this notion of incremental versus transformational change and how you assess that. So you have a number of changes that people are making, and individually they all look very incremental. Right? And is it because of that you put them on that?
No, so we actually use this Mapumo framework. I mean, so these guys, they propose this framework based on also in Africa, but in lowlands and not mountain regions. And they look at different dimensions of transformation. So I can't remember all of it, but it was like how many actors were involved in the process. So if they were disconnected, you know, just the farmers or just the government. So if there was knowledge exchange between actors, how was the scale of the changes? So it was just one village or everywhere, or there was more of a national policy. There's different things they considered, so we kind of used the same framework. I think the only thing we amended a bit, it was about, we were interested on this because I realized who is driving the changes was very important, or very different at least between mountains, so we provided a little bit more detail on that. But it was really like, I mean, even their own studies in the lowlands were most of them very incremental, not transformational, but I was surprised that for us, yeah, we scored low on everything otherwise. So, but it's a bit subjective, you know, at least the process was done using the same framework everywhere, where the kind of local experts, they reflected on it themselves, and then we put it together. But, and even the 3 sites, I said, they're a little bit more transformational. Themselves, they view themselves as just incremental. It's just that when we had the meeting discussing all together, we realized, well, yeah, but actually you are doing a little bit more than the others, so you should definitely be a little bit more that side.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, especially when you look at individual sites, you know, all of those incremental changes
Can be,
add up
Mm-hmm.
to sort of movement towards transformation
Mm-hmm.
that together
Mm-hmm.
and using that framework that you just mentioned may
Mhm.
not actually show.
Mm-hmm.
So,
No, I agree. I think it's a tricky one, right? Because it's also, sometimes it's just incremental, and suddenly, poof, the system changed, right? So we
Yeah.
don't know where we are yet,
Exactly.
right? But I think for us, it was just to, kind of the message was that most of what's going on is small at the moment. And we really wanted to focus on, a big thing on transformation has been on this knowledge exchange among actors. And this is something we criticize, that except this case of the elite farmers in Kenya, say, in most of the other areas, the government or the big NGO working there, whatever, comes and they give you improved seeds. And actually, I never come back to ask, hey, how did it go? You know, did it work? Or actually, your improved seeds now need more fertilizer and pesticide, and you don't have the money to buy them. So actually, your improved seeds are useless without these other things. So I think it was more to show that what people tend to say it's more transformational is not happening, because there's these other barriers there that are like, but no, I agree, and it's relative, right? I mean,
absolutely.
things change over time, so.
Other questions? Oh, yeah, there's one.
Yeah, please.
Dick, could you unmute yourself? I think you had a question.
He always has a question.
I'm not sure we can see that.
Can you add volume maybe?
Yeah, maybe.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Let me.
no, there's an echo.
Please
Okay.
use yours, I think, because mine is very low. So.
Okay. Dick?
Okay, I'm a emeritus faculty with the Soil and Crop Science Department,
Mm-hmm.
and I spent a lot of time working overseas, actually over 50 years. My first concern is very often I have looked at climatic variability, rainfall variability, as kind of a planning tool or a responding tool. The rainfall variability in the middle of the rainy season is typically 40%. That's a lot more than you have in terms of the incremental advances in climate change. So how can you separate those in the time and the season that you're working in? And the other question is more of a general question. I am very concerned about dietary energy balance, in which most smallholder farmers have access to maybe 250 calories, 2,500 calories a day, 2,000 of which go for basic metabolism. If you want them to work all day, you need 4,000. That's a big difference, and this limits farmers to only a couple hours of diligent work, perhaps spaced over 4 or 5 hours. In Kenya, the casual labor day is only 5 hours and no double timing. This then expands the overtime of which basically you can't hoe your way out of poverty. It's just physically impossible. And so I get a very heavy promotion in use and access to mechanization and things like that. A couple of years ago, I put a symposium there, joined a symposium there in the same room you're in now, in which I reviewed my 50 years of work. I'm about ready to post the link to that in my website. I do manage a website on smallholder agriculture that's embedded in the College of Agriculture's website. Okay? Did I say enough?
So thanks Nick for the comment. So I agree that there's a lot of variability in some sites more than others, and that's why in the beginning I said that sometimes when a lot of studies have also focused on just comparing local perceptions of change with meteorological data, and that's why I say it's important to see what you compare to be able that they agree or they don't agree. So so yes, there's variation, but I think in some cases the variation, I think it's how can I put it, like so large that maybe that's why it's easier to see. But I'm not saying everywhere. So in some cases it's yeah, speaker, I don't know how to say it, but anyway. But let me take to the second question. So I'm not saying that we should not mechanize agriculture and use improved varieties or so on to boost yields. And I agree that most places the dietary intake is not enough, or not just on the amount of calories that you mentioned, but I think in other places I work, because I mean this is just part of my work, we're working also on in wild plants intake and like wild animals, so I'm quite interested in bushmeat intake as a source of not just protein but also iron for some indigenous people. So yes, I think it's a big problem because they're just not eating enough or not eating enough of the right amount of things that we need, vitamins and so on. So a big issue. Of course, mechanizing agriculture in some mountain regions is challenging because of the steep terrains. So yeah, there's more that needs to be done. But for me, the point was more that sometimes the interventions don't give the full set. So a lot of organizations or even the government are giving improved varieties without helping with other things like the more fertilizer or more pesticide or other things that are on the way that need to go together. So then it means the intervention becomes unsuccessful because it was not provided the full set. And then it's hard for the farmers to fall back if they no longer had those other seeds available or so on. So another thing maybe that I didn't mention a lot here, and because it was not very well designed when we started this questionnaire, was about crop diversification. So traditionally many farmers cultivate a lot of crops, and that reduces the risk that one fails, particularly with the pest outbreak. But it's been also a push to more to boost yields in a way as well, to have just one crop or two crops, and then it makes them more susceptible to diseases. The idea is that then they can sell this crop usually easier to market, but also it has a challenge, and then the price is plummet because everybody's growing the same thing and harvesting at the same time. So there's a lot of challenges, but for us, I think the main idea was to document what happens in the mountains, because most research on the topic has been on the lowlands. And don't get me wrong, a lot of things happen in the lowlands. It was just that there was a lot of challenges also. But we just wanted to highlight that things are happening in the mountains as well, and maybe some of the changes are a little bit different because of this elevational gradient. And maybe even some of the solutions also need to be different, because you cannot put a tractor up a slope that it's like this, right? Even if you get subsidy to do it and so on. So we also need to think maybe a little bit more innovative of what else can be done in these areas. So that was the idea.
Just
couple comments.
Yeah, sure.
One is that, I mean, it's pretty well known that a lot of NGOs actually bring in different crops that aren't actually food for local people, you know, or can't be grown there. So that's my comment on that.
Yeah, but they keep doing it, right?
Yeah, of course.
Surprisingly.
The other thing is, you know, that mismatch between meteorological data and people's perceptions is not, I mean, we see it all over the place, but until you understand what's meaningful to people, then you can actually understand what's important. So, you know, I work with pastoralists, and so if a drought comes in, meteorologically there's no rain, but if livestock are not dying, it didn't happen,
Yeah.
right? So you have to take into account what's really important to people.
Mm-hmm.
And then my last kind of comment or question was with your introduction, and that is that generational exchange of information from parents to children or grandparents on down. But what we're finding with Indigenous people around the world is that generational gap in knowledge is occurring under these sort of Western external pressures, and that makes them less able to deal with these changes that are occurring. Yeah.
That's a very big challenge, I think, as well. That so the intergenerational change, and there's been some work showing that the older farmers are actually having higher yields even in remote areas, just because they have this experience to pay a little bit more attention. Maybe they're not so much into innovation, but they really pay more attention and they understand the local context better than the younger ones. So, sadly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
On the topic of interventions, transformative things that stick, the idea of what NGOs are doing with seeds, and many times the partnerships the NGOs have are with large seed companies. And you know, I'm doing a project, and a big fan of the project is the director at Bayer Crop Science for India, Asia, and Africa. And I'm on a call with him and Agra, and they're working with Gates to try to get these seeds in, these hybrid seeds. And the seeds have these properties that are actually beneficial, possibly transformative. But nobody's thinking about what Dick said, mechanization. So the first thing the farmer says when they're reporting in this call of their introduction and attempt to commercialize and distribute, the first thing the farmer says is, "That's great, it can double my yield, fantastic. Now tell me how I'm going to get it to a market, because I don't have physical access, or the physical access I have cannot accommodate the extra amount of crop." So the adoption sometimes just dies right there, simply because they're not thinking in a systemic, you know, holistic way about how do you realize the true potential of a seed. You don't realize it by making sure they're planting it. Yeah.
It's a lot more to it. That's the challenge. And that's why I think it's very important, this communication, right? How maybe it's hard to communicate to every single farmer, but if there's some group leaders or cooperative or like extension workers that are trusted, because that's also a big issue is trust as well. Even in some areas where you have downscale, rather good meteorological information available, people don't trust it because it comes from an outsider. An outsider could just be another Kenyan, but just from another tribe or from another area, right? So issues of trust are a challenge in many areas. So I think that's why we need more participatory work, like being together, so we can really build the trust and try to be open about some of these other challenges that come together. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I don't know if this is trivial, but you talked earlier about how you observed changes in winds during the wet season. And I was wondering what challenges that presented to communities where that was occurring.
So sometimes it's the flowering and fruiting of certain fruit trees. The flowers drop, or the early and mature fruits drop, so they have lower yields. In some other areas is that the cereals bend, so then the yields are also lower. And I mean, I just kind of bring the summary of things that were mentioned, but a couple of sites it was very interesting because they mentioned more hailstorms. And I was like, okay, well, so what? It's like, well, it destroys everything, right? So hail destroys particularly fruit crops. So that's also something that is challenging to deal with if you don't have the money to invest in like giant mosquito nets or something that protects your crops. So I think a lot of the work, and don't get me wrong, I think it's important, it's about changing rainfall, but there's other extreme events that may really ruin like yields and crops or livestock, and then we maybe need to also think more about it. That's why I think talking to the farmers, you get some of these other things that are relevant. And maybe I'll just say one as an insight that was really shocking. So in the site in Congo, so there's not been a lot of work in the eastern part of Congo, although there's people also report changes. And for them, they said, oh, the biggest challenge is the increased rainfall during the dry season. And I thought, well, most of the farmers in Africa dealing with either floods or droughts, or so you guys, why do you complain about having more rainfall in the dry season? And it turns out that it's really bad because they rely on cassava. And if you have rain during the period where you're drying your cassava and you're storing it, the sooty mold disease, which is this horrible disease, spreads out. So then the yields are the same, they just get ruined very fast during the storage period, so they actually go hungry. So this is something also. So the challenges can be multiple, and sometimes they are overlooked by some of the biggest development agencies. So cassava is not one of the main things we can solve with improved seeds, right? So that's other, I mentioned.
Yes.
Did anyone in your interviews or focus groups mention anything about increased contact or presence of wild animals?
Yeah, also. Mm-hmm. So, that, how you call it, that they come out of the forest and destroy crops. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, right, changes. It's just, that's the thing that we often take things as separated from each other, but of course these farms are next to forests or other things, so things move. So, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Johnny.